and gentlemen. My name is Haja Narshikin. I'm the Assistant Director at the Department of International Trade, Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade of Brunei Darussalam. I've been heavily involved in the investment policy coordination, cooperation in which also extending to investment treaty negotiations on behalf of Brunei Darussalam for over 10 years, both at the bilateral, regional, and multilateral levels. Specifically in the context of ASEAN, up to August this year, I was the chair of the ASEAN Coordinating Committee on Investment, which is the main body in ASEAN looking after investment policy cooperation. And I'm also currently the chair of the ASEAN-Japan Working Group and the ASEAN-Japan Comprehensive Economic Partnership. Now, similar to what the example set by the moderators before, what I'll do first is I'll provide a brief snapshot on the state of play of investment cooperation in ASEAN. Dato', our speaker, will probably allude to it as well in his presentation, so I won't dwell too much on it. But basically, investment policy cooperation in ASEAN has been coordinated through a series of agreements, the most recent being the ASEAN Comprehensive Investment Agreement, which is the successor to the ASEAN Investment Guarantee Agreement and also the ASEAN Investment Area Agreement. Now the ACIA, that we call it ACIA, it only just came into force this year, so it's really very new. But it focuses on liberalization and protection of investments. So it is seen as an effort to enhance the transparency of investment regulations and to provide more predictability for foreign investors. Investment promotion and facilitation is also a key component of ACIA and regional investment cooperation. So against that backdrop, the purpose of this session really is to first get an overview from our speaker on what are his thoughts on ASEAN's ability to attract FDI as a single investment destination, in line with the goal of establishing the ASEAN Economic Community. Then I would like to invite our panelists to share their insights from their private sector, and I will introduce them individually later on, how they view the investment environment in ASEAN, how they view investment environment in the region generally, and perhaps share any specific ideas that they may have. So with that, can I invite our speaker for this session, Dato' Noharuddin Nordin, to provide your presentation. Now, Dato' Noharuddin Nordin, since August last year, has been appointed as the Chief Executive Officer of the Malaysian Investment Development Authority, or MIDA, which is a government principal agency promoting foreign and direct investment. Prior to MIDA, he has served as the Chief Executive Officer of the Malaysian External Trade Development, or MATRADE, since 2006, so he has wide experience in the international business. He was also previously in the Ministry of International Trade and Industry, or MITI, of Malaysia, and he also, prior to that, served as the Malaysian Trade Commissioner to New York. So, Dato', would you like to give us your presentation? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Haja. It's always difficult to speak in the afternoon like this. Normally, in a conference like this, you call this session it's kind of the night session or something like that, because you're literally talking to half zombies here. But let's try to make a full use of the time that we have this afternoon. Given the task of speaking on is ASEAN able to compete for a larger share of FDIs? I have to qualify here that what I'm going to say are purely my personal view. It's not the view of the government of Malaysia. All right? And Haja, I will not be elaborating on what the framework that ASEAN have created for itself in the investment, because I'm coming from the perspective of a marketeer, a person who promotes investment rather than a policymaker or a regulator. So I'll just have a few slides on data to provide a backdrop to what I'm going to say. Then I'll try to come up with some more on some practical challenges that we face in terms of positioning ASEAN in the context of global investments, and to share with you some ideas that I have moving forward. Next. All right. Here, the first slide shows that in terms of global share of FDI, our share is rather moderate, 7.7% in the year 2011, but when compared to 5 years ago, it's not that bad. There has been an increase, but still, remember, it's still relatively moderate compared to the total global FDI. Next. And when compared to the BRICS countries, the BRICS, as you know, have been exciting the global market a lot the last decade or so. But when we compare ASEAN to the BRICS country, we are doing quite well. In fact, we are closing our gap with China in terms of FDI. As we know, the China market has a population double that of ASEAN, and yet we are challenging China in terms of FDI. So it seems that on the surface, when you look at the macro data, ASEAN is doing quite all right in terms of attracting FDI. However, if we go a little deeper, next, yeah. Although ASEAN is doing well, the performance within ASEAN is very, very skewed. As you can see, one member of the ASEAN countries is responsible for 50% of total FDIs cumulatively over the last 5 years. And the rest of us share the other 50%. So this is something we have to note. Yeah? While overall ASEAN is doing well, but actually the contribution to that growth is mainly come from only one member countries of ASEAN. So next, we are talking here in the context of the ASEAN Economic Community 2015. That's only 3 years down the road. Time is running short. I think we can still continue to talk about policy advocacy, what we should do in terms of strengthening the framework to facilitate more intra-ASEAN trade and business. But I think we have to start thinking of how we want to make it work. That's the most important thing at this stage. 3 years is nothing in the context of international business. Next. Although I will not elaborate on the framework, these are some of the frameworks that are already in place. The ACIA, the AFAS, and the ATIGA, and this morning, as we say, soon there will be the Agreement of the Movement of Natural Persons. All will contribute toward enhancing and making more conducive the investment environment in ASEAN. Changes in the global, as I mentioned, the global environment is changing rapidly. Some of the ASEAN framework will initiate, some of the countries are affected differently from other countries, and we can expect the responses will be different. So we talk about unity, we talk about presenting ASEAN as a single destination for investment. Is it a real thing? Is it possible? But personally, I think that ASEAN is a great product to promote, but we have to rethink about the way we promote ASEAN as investment destination. And there's a lot of prospects, but who in the world can really recognize this value of ASEAN investment destination? See, you notice many of our roadshows, we bring our roadshows to Europe, to America, to many parts of the world. But in the world of business, who really know ASEAN better than us? Or who in the business community really know the intricacies of investing in ASEAN? Next. I believe those companies, those ASEAN MNCs, and those global MNCs that are already operating in ASEAN are the best business to take advantage of what ASEAN has to offer, because they have been in this market for a long time. They know the intricacies, they know the challenges that we are discussing this morning about the disparity of the gap in terms of development. We talk about the single window, for example, how some countries are more prepared than others to contribute to the concept of single window. All these are real issues. And these companies that have been in the region, or either they are local multinationals, they know this problem. So my suggestion is we should intensify our promotion in terms of getting these companies to show that there are advantages to operate in ASEAN, because they know how to operate in ASEAN. They know how to overcome the challenges, the inadequacies in some markets in order to take full advantage of what ASEAN has to offer. So I would suggest, in fact, the title of our symposium today is about private sector perspective. I think we have to engage the private sector more and more intensely. And initiatives, for example, such as the CIMB ASEAN Research Institute are good, because these are initiatives that are being started by the private sector. My final word is, we really have to make the ASEAN economic community a little more sexy than what it is today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dato'. So I'd like to now introduce our distinguished panel for this session. Starting on my left, Mr. Stuart Dean. He's currently the Chief Executive Officer of ASEAN for GE Global Growth and Operations. He brings with him over 20 years of experience working across GE businesses in US and Asia in senior positions in sales, services, marketing, and general management. He has been serving GE in the region since 1991, so ASEAN is very close to his heart. From Business Development Manager of GE International based in Singapore, he became President of GE Capital Southeast Asia in '93, and President of GE Indonesia, located here in Jakarta in '95. And Stu currently has responsibility for all of ASEAN and resides in Kuala Lumpur, Malaysia.
So what would I like to see? What are some of the challenges maybe going forward? In particular, I think there's we do track the competitiveness studies and the ease of doing business studies, and there had been good, solid progress on that throughout ASEAN over the last couple of years, but a little falling back in the latest version of those studies. So, but that's what I like, Tarak, is a little competition within the ASEAN region across countries is a good thing, because it forces everybody to improve their game. And as everybody improves their game, ASEAN becomes even more attractive.
That if you use the word integration or economic integration, it sometimes can create a different set of expectations, because I think ASEAN is not aiming to integrate economies in the same way that you imagine integration in the European Union, for instance. So if you consistently use that word, I think it creates a different or wrong set of expectations. And where I think we are actually looking to head towards is more harmonization. And I think that's where, if we try and decouple integration and harmonization, we can actually be much more focused on what are the areas where we can harmonize rather than integrate economies. And maybe I think echoing Dr. Noranuddin's points, if you look at what are some of the big ideas that can attract FDI to ASEAN, I think the single market and production base is the main big idea. If you look at ASEAN as a population, 600 million, as a GDP per capita, it's 3 times that of India. So as a market, it's huge. The potential is huge. For the consumer goods sector, one data point I can share, ASEAN consumers spend about $5 per person on cosmetics. And Korean consumers spend about $70 per person on cosmetics. Chinese consumers spend about $12 per person on cosmetics. So the room for growth is tremendous. If you can unlock that single market and production base, you can really unlock that room for growth and the room for FDI. And then the next question becomes, how do we unlock that single market and production base? And that's where the one big idea, I think, here is regulatory harmonization. So that can help you to access all the different markets in ASEAN under one set of regulations that are seamless and really helps SMEs even extend into different markets. And on that, I think, if you look at a few examples for us, we buy raw materials in Indonesia a lot, about $400 million worth of raw materials every year. And we send that raw material to Malaysia, where we process in an oleochemical plant in Malaysia. And we send the processed chemicals to a plant in Thailand, where we then manufacture that into shampoo. And then from there, we sell shampoo across ASEAN and even outside of ASEAN. So that's the kind of value chain that we have today. But if you look at some, for example, I know an SME, and the SME designs, or it's in the apparel business, and it designs apparel in Singapore. It prints the apparel in the US. It gets trimmings and it gets tags made in Malaysia. And it gets the trimmings, the fabrics that are printed in the US, all sent to Indonesia, and the garments are sold in Indonesia, and then it's sold in the rest of ASEAN. But that business is an SME. In fact, it's a one-woman business, and the person is my wife. So, but the supply chain is also global, and it's also regional in ASEAN, and it's very similar to the same supply chain that P&G uses. And if you can really break down the barriers of regulation such that something that is manufactured in one ASEAN country is recognized and accepted in all the ASEAN countries, and I don't have to, if entrepreneur in Indonesia makes a new herbal cream that can help men grow their hair back, I have to go to Vietnam and I have to get the chemicals tested and approved, and I have to go to Malaysia and I have to go to the Philippines and do that over and over again. I think that creates real barriers for that entrepreneur to expand into new markets in ASEAN. But if you can have one sort of ASEAN regulatory authority that can recognize, approve for acceptance across ASEAN, I think that's where you really access the single market and production base. So I think that's the sort of big idea that I'd like to leave behind. We really look at, forget about integration, look at harmonization, and look at what you can do to really harmonize regulations, which will help both SMEs as well as multinationals like ourselves invest in ASEAN.
And I particularly like how Director Iman described this morning that the AEC is really a state of becoming rather than an end game. So it really is up to us how we shape and form and bring this to life, because at the end of the day, I don't really think there is an end game, because as we achieve, we try to do better. So it is a constant evolution of the AEC, and it might be another name 10 years from now, but it is the spirit of operating as one nation. So I think that's precisely what the excitement of the AEC brings to us. And so I'd like to take this opportunity, of course, to thank the organizers, Dr. Lim, for putting this symposium together, the Australian AID for sponsoring it, and for inviting us to be here as representatives of the private sector to put our point of view on the table and to make sure that the dialogue does happen. As Datuk mentioned, your biggest advocates for the AEC is the businesses that have already been here, and again, by way of history, our involvement with the region takes us back to Thailand, 50 years, the Philippines and Indonesia, 40 plus years, Malaysia, 30 years, Vietnam more recently in 15 years. So we really appreciate the gains that we've been able to make together with ASEAN. Our basic principle for operation is to build cars where they're used. And 50 years ago, when we started operations in Thailand, that's precisely what we did, to serve the needs of local motorists and make sure that the cars are built where they're used. But over the years, in partnership with the ASEAN, we've evolved from just building cars for specific countries to exchanging components regionally through the BBC when that was put into effect. So we were able to expand our base and achieve better economies of scale. Subsequently, we had ICO and then CPT after that. And so we've now become re-exporters of vehicle regionally. So we've been able to streamline our production base across the region. And more recently, ASEAN has taken a very significant role as a global production base. So we're actually now exporting from ASEAN to South America, to South Africa, to the Middle East. So we have evolved, and so we really appreciate the gains of our partnership with ASEAN, and we really are looking forward to the next stage, what the AEC brings, and again, as rightfully stated at the start of the symposium, what is it that we can do from now on? And why we're excited is because in terms of our business in Toyota and the automotive industry, the single market represents so much for us. Rough estimates for total number of units in operation or vehicles on the road is about 25 million. This year we're probably going to sell a total of about 3.3 million new vehicles in the ASEAN states. That's almost similar to what Japan sells if we exclude the K cars or the small cars. So the potential for us is huge, and it becomes even more pronounced if we look at the fact that our stage of motorization is nowhere near. We're just at the cusp of motorization. Japan's motorization, they have 59 cars per 100 people. The US is 78 cars per 100 people. In our region, Malaysia has the highest rate of motorization with about 38 cars per 100 people. And then we have Thailand and Singapore with 16. And then you have Indonesia with 8, the Philippines with 3, and Vietnam with 2. So the opportunities for growth are just tremendous as a market. And that really, really, really excites us. And as we get that economies of scale, that reinforces again our platform to be a more effective and more significant global production base. Finally, and just at the end of the day, business is just like water, I think. We seek our own level, so we don't need a lot of impediments. Every rock you put in, we're just going to find our way around it and find our level. So we need for the ASEAN to take a stronger leadership and really present business with what it is that we can do when the AEC comes into force that we can't do as well or better currently by dealing with each individual nation state. So where does nation-led policy end and where does ASEAN-led policy begin? I think we need to be able to define this more clearly so that business can really include ASEAN in our visioning for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Vince. Paul.
Thank you, Madam Chairman, Your Excellency, and you've stolen some of my thunder. I was thanking the presenter, and I can't help but refer to the previous sessions, and the previous session on the seamless movement of goods, and has a great bearing on investment. But everything that my three previous panelists have actually said leads into what I'm saying now. And that's when you make an investment, you don't make it in isolation. Each factory needs to receive its inputs from another factory or suppliers in other parts of the region and more distant location. The smooth flow of these inputs and the outflows of the finished product have a huge influence on the success of the investment. And those of you who've done business cases, the person who made the business case and the factory didn't work no longer works for the company. Right. So hello? Yes, I put up a few slides which are just background to what I'm saying. Right, they're actually along the same theme. The benefits of cheap labour can easily be offset by high transport costs, slow supply chains, customs delays, and the uncertainty of delivery dates, JIT, which is just what you mentioned. If your labour cost is $200 a month cheaper, but your logistics costs are $500 a tonne more, you're in a worse than you were before. Now, the bottom line for that is the example that in Cambodia, the garment workers earn $65, $70 a month, very, very cheap. But to get the cargo out to market is like pulling teeth. You have to fly it out on what? There are baby aeroplanes, or you ship it out by sea to Singapore and then fly it on real aeroplanes. The same thing happens up in Hanoi. Massive amounts of investments have gone into North Vietnam, but the infrastructure in the transport and logistics, the flights out of the airport are not there. So in the past we've had to truck freight from Hanoi to Bangkok to get it on a plane, because when the factories are busy in Hanoi, everybody's busy. The peak season in the electrics, the peak season in the garment industry around the region means you logistically paint yourself into a corner and you cannot get to market. So as a service provider, I'm a transport service provider, and I'm looking very, very keenly forward to the 2015 when freight vehicles will be able to move across borders within ASEAN. Sorry, was that a pig that flew across that room? When we need to lift containers from a Malaysian truck to a Thai truck will no longer be required on the border, with all the costs involved, the border queues, the customs delays. They'll be a thing of the past. I'm wondering why we have to wait to 2015. Why can't we do it this week, next week, or the week after? What is the problem? I'm told that the cross-border transport agreement between Thailand, Laos and Vietnam, they drive on the wrong side of the road. That's the biggest issue. Malaysia and Thailand drive on the same side of the road. Right. The UK and France have been swapping cars and trucks for 60 years, and they don't like each other, but it still works. Just a couple of points on this. When we look, this is all about the logistics. If you're going to attract investment, as Vince said, it's all like water. Water takes the line of least resistance. It goes the place where it's easiest to move. Very simple thing for you to think about is, in this region, there are 2 mega ports and 2 mega airports. One is in Singapore, one is in Hong Kong. They are the places that people use because they're easy to use, they're quick to use, they're 24/7. They don't have 9 hours for lunch and 10 days for holidays. They work night and day, and the places run smoothly. And that's why we could see 49% of the investment has gone around that airport and around that seaport, because they're easy places to do business.
I think you've answered the call for bold and candid comments asked by DSG Lim this morning, so thank you. We have some time for question and answer. I'd like to now open the floor, and can I request that before you ask your question, if you could introduce yourself, as well as the organization which you represent, and also please indicate whether your question is directed at any particular panelist. The floor is now open. Yes, sir. Gentleman in the front.
Nobody else there with burning questions. Just thank you very much for very interesting presentations. The first speaker with the slides on the investment, again, it is amazing how important Singapore is. Sometimes one wonders, what would ASEAN be without Singapore? The trade figures show the same thing, when it is about intra-ASEAN trade. 45%, I think, of total ASEAN trade. I don't think you have to be too depressed by the fact that you are presenting your own country and not, or your own country as part of ASEAN. I think you, at the same time, you promote ASEAN, you show that ASEAN, what ASEAN offers, and your country is part of it, and it is, that's life. I mean, that's German cars compete, I mean, I come from the European Union, compete with French cars. When business people sit with in one plane with a political leader and they get off the plane, they compete with each other. I mean, don't think you should be. Well, I was very pleased to hear from the General Electric man that you don't worry too much about 2015, if it is 2015 or 1 or 2 years later. I didn't hear what you exactly said afterwards. As long as the, I obviously said as long as the, yes, it continues to improve, as long as there's movement. A deadline one puts for, especially for oneself, to keep the pressure on, and the outside world should not think that the case is hopeless if you don't meet that deadline. It's okay. Sorry, I don't have a specific question. It was so crystal clear. Thanks.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I just want to respond to that. I think today there's been some talk about incentives, and I think if you think about the economic integration process, when countries first start off, it's very common to think about what you have to lose versus what you have to gain. So people focus often on what you have to lose if you integrate and if you give up something. What are you giving up and what are you getting? But there's always a tipping point in that process where, as economies become integrated, what you have to gain becomes much more than what you are giving up. And when you reach that point, automatically, I don't worry, because automatically the incentives will be, if you don't get on board, you will lose much more than what you have to gain by protecting yourself and staying out of it. So I think in terms of the incentives, as long as Stu was saying we keep making good progress, we will get to that tipping point soon, and I think the incentives will align, and there'll be much more to gain from being involved than you lose.
Thank you. Any other questions from the floor? Everybody seems to be quite happy with the presentation and also the very frank statements. DSG.
Perhaps just a few comments on to the panelists. I mean, I really appreciate your bold views and make sure that all these are not in vain, because my intention is that after the symposium is concluded, what we intend to do is to put everything in the paper and for us to present to the minister and to say that we try to test the water, and this is how lukewarm it is at the moment. And then though there are prospects and there's something, we still got a lot of things for us to do before we hit 2015. If I may go to David, it goes beyond harmonization, because as Vince pointed out, when you try to facilitate for trading goods, you have to look into the issue of standards. It means like what we're trying to do here in ASEAN, we have one product, one test accepted everywhere, so they actually facilitate the flow of goods. And when you talk about harmonizations, of course, you talk about investment rules, so that when one investor comes to ASEAN, any country, they know what are the normal procedures they have to go through before they can actually set the operation, and to make sure it's easier for one investor to invest in one country than the other. So it's like a similar sort of way of getting into the process. But when you talk about integration, if we want to set ourselves as a single market production base, integration has to be on the table. Even like when we talk about national single window, if every country in ASEAN, including CMB, set up their own national single window, they cannot operate on their own. They have to integrate, because goods follow through the whole region to the 10 country. And I do take the point that, when we try to think about Paul saying that the CBTA trying to facilitate the cross-border trade, we do have a framework good on transit that was signed in 1998, and then now it's 2012. We're still in the process of trying to operationalize it, and while in the midst of doing that, to take the cue from Ramant from Asia was saying that one way or the other, the AEC integration will go ahead, and it will be driven by the business, because while waiting for the framework agreement to come into place, the private sector has been lobbying the government to have bilateral agreements, a network of bilateral agreement, while waiting for the framework agreement to put in place in order for the business to survive. So this is something that we really have to take into account. I mean, going back to Stuart, I think I could thank you for your email. It was the first email from the private sector since I took up my job back in April. And then basically when you talk about GE's investment strategy based on economy of scale, and then we're grateful that GE among one of the lead country to actually set up an ASEAN department to say we're looking at the whole region as a country rather than any specific country, looking at the 500 or 600 million market where we can focus in. And this is something that we have to work on. And I do concur with Dato in his presentation. And sometimes when we go out, we actually tend to talk about our own country in the context of ASEAN rather than ASEAN per se. So that's why even in the roadshow, this is something we have to really sort of get our act together, because if we believe in setting up a community by 2015, we have to see ourselves as one country.
How I wish, these are brilliant interventions from the panelists. How I wish that there are more private sector representatives listening to what they are saying.
Well, this is, as we know, this is the first in a series of AEC Symposium, so that will feed back into the ASEAN Secretary's planning for the subsequent symposiums. Increase the participation of private sectors. So I believe that is all the time that we have for our session. It's certainly been very engaging with all the inputs that's been put forward in discussing the development and progress in establishing ASEAN as a more integrated and attractive investment destination. If I can just sum up some of the very key points that's been discussed by our panelists and also in the presentation. Prospects, business prospects and outlook for ASEAN, it's quite good, seems to be quite good. The opportunities for growth is tremendous, but there are continuing challenges that needs to be addressed, be it the lack of adequate infrastructure, poor logistics, which translates into higher costs, which is detrimental not just for MNCs, but also SMEs, and could curb their development. The lack of transparency and too much oversight, and the different standards and requirements across ASEAN. The deadline of 2015, not that crucial in your minds, as long as ASEAN continues on its path towards improving the business and investment climate in the region. So I'd like to thank our speaker, Dato, and all our panel members for your active contribution. It's certainly been a pleasure for me personally to be part of the session and to be joined by all of you who represent some of the biggest and most established companies in the world. And your perspectives were exactly what the symposium had sought to target. So on behalf of the organizers, I'd like to thank you for your participation. So ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of our session. Thank you for your attention, and please do join me in thanking our speakers and esteemed panel members.
Thank you very much, Haja Noor Ashikin Haji Johari, and fellow moderators and speakers and panelists.